the empire that drowned in gold. Have you ever held so much money in your hands that it actually destroyed you? I mean, not just lost it or spent it badly, but had so much wealth pour in that it literally tore your entire world apart? Because I'm about to tell you about the richest empire in human history and how all that treasure became the very thing that killed it. And here's why this kept me up at night when I discovered it. We're making the exact same mistakes right now. Let me take you back to something that blew my mind when I first learned it. When I was in school, they taught me that Britain had the largest empire the world had ever seen, right? The sun never sets on the British Empire and all that. But here's what they didn't tell me. Before Britain, before anyone, there was Spain. And in the 16th century, Spain didn't just have an empire, they had the empire. The first truly global empire in human history. I'm talking about territories stretching from Europe to Africa, from the Americas all the way to Asia. They were everywhere. And that famous phrase, "the sun never sets on the empire"? Yeah, the British borrowed that from Spain. They said it first because it was true first. But here's where this story gets absolutely wild and why I had to share it with you. This empire, the wealthiest the world had ever seen, collapsed. Not because they ran out of money, not because they were conquered by a stronger force. They collapsed under the weight of their own treasure. Too much gold, too much silver, too much wealth. I know that sounds impossible. How can you have too much money? Stick with me, because what happened to Spain is happening around us right now, and most people have no idea. It all started in 1492. Spain stumbles into the New World, and suddenly they hit what looked like an infinite jackpot. Gold and silver in quantities that no European kingdom could even imagine started pouring into Spanish hands. When I first read the numbers, I literally had to check them twice because they seemed fake. In 1521, they conquered Mexico and toppled the Aztec Empire. This gave them access to these incredibly rich mines in a place called Zacatecas. Then, just a decade later, they conquered Peru, shattered the Inca Empire, and unlocked something called Potosí. This wasn't just a mine, this was a literal mountain of silver. They called it the mountain that eats men, and for more than a century, it fed a constant conveyor belt of treasure crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Let me give you the numbers because they're insane. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported an estimated 180,000 tons of silver and 2,000 tons of gold. When I first saw this statistic, I didn't understand how massive it was, so I looked it up. That's more silver than all of Europe had mined in the previous 1,000 years, combined. Think about that. 1,000 years of mining, and Spain brought in more than that in just 150 years. This treasure didn't just change Spain, it reshaped the entire world. From the Spanish ports of Seville and Cadiz, ships carried bullion east to the Mediterranean, north to the Low Countries, and even west across the Pacific to Manila, where they traded silver for Chinese silk and porcelain. This was the birth of the first truly global economy, and Spain sat right at the center of it all. Now here's something that absolutely shocked me as an American. When Jamestown, the first permanent English colony, was founded in 1607, it was basically just a swamp where people were struggling to survive, right? Well, at that exact same time, Mexico City already had universities, printing presses, and massive cathedrals. Lima was a thriving, sophisticated city. And get this, St. Augustine in Florida, founded by Spain in 1565, was the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States. That's 42 years before Jamestown even existed. Spain wasn't just ahead of everyone else. They were building global infrastructure, ruling vast territories, and living in wealth, while Britain and France were still fumbling around with failed colonies and tiny settlements. So you'd think, right, that with all this treasure, all this head start, all this power, Spain would dominate for centuries. They'd be unstoppable. But that's not what happened. Not even close. Because here's what I learned, and it changed how I see money forever. Spain confused treasure with wealth, and those two things are not the same. The silver was real. The gold was real. You could touch it, weigh it, ship it. But what they did with it turned their greatest strength into their greatest weakness. Prices in Spain exploded. I'm talking about serious inflation. Between 1500 and 1600, prices quadrupled. Imagine going to buy bread, and over your lifetime, that same loaf goes from costing 1 coin to costing 4 coins. Ordinary Spaniards found bread, clothing, basic necessities harder and harder to afford, even though their nation was literally sitting on mountains of silver. Why? This is the part that made it all click for me. Money only holds value when it's scarce enough to be trusted. When too much money pours into an economy, its purchasing power collapses. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a small town where bread costs 1 coin. Suddenly, 10 times more coins arrive in that town, but the number of bakers stays the same. The number of loaves of bread stays the same. The bakers realize people have more coins, so what do? They charge more. Soon, bread costs 2 coins, then 3, then 4. Not because bread got better or more valuable, but because the coins became worth less. That was Spain's fate. That was their curse. Economists actually have a name for this. They call it the price revolution. It was the first great wave of global inflation, triggered by too much silver chasing too few goods. But here's the truly cruel part. The inflation didn't hit everyone equally. The elites, the nobles, the merchants, the bankers who handled the silver first, they profited before prices adjusted. They got rich. But ordinary people living on fixed wages, they got crushed. They were left behind, watching their purchasing power evaporate. The irony was absolutely brutal. The more silver Spain brought in, the poorer its own people felt. Silver that should have been a blessing became poison. But the mistakes ran even deeper than inflation, and this is where I really started to see the parallels to today. Instead of investing in productive industries, building factories, developing trade networks, creating things of value, Spain just spent its fortune on imports. They became consumers, not producers. Italian merchants, Dutch traders, German craftsmen, they all grew rich selling luxuries to Spain, and Spain paid for everything with American silver. Meanwhile, Spain's own industries withered and died. Why build anything when you can just wait for the next treasure fleet to arrive and buy whatever you want? Why innovate? Why invest in your own economy? Spain turned into a nation of buyers, not builders. And every coin they spent made their rivals richer and stronger. And then there were the wars. Oh, the wars. The Spanish monarchs, the Habsburg dynasty, saw themselves as the defenders of Catholicism after the Protestant Reformation. That was their mission, their identity. And that mission carried an astronomical price tag. Treasure from Mexico and Peru funded wars against the Ottoman Turks. It financed armies to crush the Dutch revolt. It kept Spain tangled up in the French wars of religion. They poured staggering amounts of money into the 30 Years' War, one of the bloodiest conflicts Europe has ever seen, where Catholic and Protestant states ripped each other apart across the continent. And then there was the Spanish Armada of 1588. You've probably heard of it. This massive fleet sent to crush Protestant England, fueled entirely by New World silver. When that armada failed, the financial shock was devastating. So where did all the gold and silver actually go? Into battlefields, into ships, into debt. Because here's the really crazy part. Spain wasn't just spending the treasure that arrived. They were borrowing against treasure that hadn't even landed yet. German banking families like the Fugers and later Genoese financiers, they advanced enormous loans to the Spanish crown, secured by future silver shipments. In theory, it was brilliant. The mines of Potosí would keep the silver flowing forever, so why not borrow against the future? In practice, it was financial suicide. Because if a fleet was delayed, or wrecked in a storm, or intercepted by pirates at sea, Spain couldn't pay. Spain defaulted. And they didn't default once. They defaulted repeatedly, 4 times in the 16th century alone, 1557, 1575, 1596, and 1607. Let that sink in.
Imagine being the richest empire in the entire world and still declaring bankruptcy every couple of decades. That was Spain's reality. They had all the treasure, and they still couldn't pay their debts. And then we get to the pirates. When I learned about this part, I realized the pirates weren't just random criminals looking for loot. They were weapons of economic warfare. England and the Netherlands figured out something brilliant and ruthless. If you strike the treasure fleets, you don't just steal bullion, you collapse Spain's entire credit system. Francis Drake,
backed by Queen Elizabeth herself, circled the globe in the 1580s, plundering Spanish galleons left and right. He came back to England with treasure worth half of England's annual revenue, half, from one voyage. Then there's Piet Hein, a Dutch privateer. In 1628, he captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet off the coast of Cuba. 11 million guilders worth of silver. That single strike nearly toppled Spain's finances all over again. See, every time a fleet was lost, it wasn't just a bad day at sea. It was a sovereign default happening in real time. Spain had already borrowed against that silver. They'd already promised it to creditors. When pirates or storms took it, creditors across Europe were left unpaid. Meanwhile, England and the Netherlands took all that stolen silver and reinvested it into navies, banks, and trading companies. They were building the foundations of their future empires with Spain's lifeblood. Spain's greatest asset had become its greatest vulnerability. By the early 1600s, Spain still looked mighty on the maps. The empire still stretched across oceans. The kings still sat in opulent palaces. The cathedrals were still filled with treasures from the Americas. But the empire was hollow, financially gutted. Inflation had destroyed domestic prosperity. Debt had chained the crown to foreign bankers. And piracy had turned Spain's treasure into a liability. For ordinary Spaniards, all that wealth was an illusion. Prices kept rising, wages stayed flat, and taxes climbed higher and higher to pay for wars that never seemed to end. The world's richest empire was eating itself alive. And while Spain was collapsing under its own treasure, other powers were watching, learning, and doing the exact opposite. The English, the Dutch, and later the French saw the lesson clearly. Bullion alone does not make an empire. Spain's entire system was built on extraction, mines, tribute, treasure fleets. Their colonies existed to funnel wealth back home, not to grow into thriving economies of their own. It was plunder, not production. Britain took a completely different approach. North America wasn't rich in gold or silver, but it produced tobacco, sugar, timber, and later cotton, resources that fueled industry and trade. Instead of waiting for treasure fleets, Britain built chartered companies like the East India Company. They developed banking institutions in London. The Dutch merchants founded the Amsterdam Stock Exchange and turned their navy into a weapon of global trade. These rivals didn't wait for treasure to show up. They built systems to generate wealth continuously. And when they did capture Spanish silver, through piracy or trade, they reinvested it. They compounded their strength while Spain hollowed itself out. This is the crucial difference that changed everything. Spain measured wealth in treasure. Britain and the Dutch measured wealth in systems. One is finite, the other is self-replicating. And history shows us very clearly which one lasts. By the mid-1600s, Spain's decline was obvious to everyone. The once mighty armada was a shadow of its former self. Inflation and repeated bankruptcies had destroyed trust in the crown. The 30 Years' War had drained whatever was left in the coffers. The Dutch Republic gained independence and built a commercial empire. England's navy grew stronger, its banking system more sophisticated. Spain still had territory, sure, but it lacked the financial muscle to defend it or develop it. The empire that had terrified all of Europe in the 1500s was, by the 1700s, just a fading giant. And this is why I couldn't stop thinking about this story. Because Spain's fall isn't just about kings and silver and pirates.
It's about the illusion of wealth. When floods of money arrive, whether from mines, from credit, from modern printing presses, the temptation is always the same. Spend it, borrow against it, burn it on wars or luxuries or things that don't build real value. But without discipline, without investment in real productivity, without building systems that last, the money doesn't just disappear. It corrodes the very foundations of society. Spain's peasants knew this firsthand. They watched silver pour into Seville only to watch bread prices soar beyond what they could afford. Today, we watch inflation erode our wages and purchasing power, even as we're told the economy is strong. The mechanisms might be different, but the pain feels exactly the same. And those pirate raids, they carry a modern echo too. Spain's treasure fleets were vulnerable because they concentrated all their wealth into single massive shipments, one big target. Today's economies concentrate wealth into fragile financial systems, into banks that are too big to fail, into debt markets balanced on razor-thin confidence. When one ship goes down or one bank collapses, the shock ripples outward, threatening default and crisis. Spain's losses to Piet Hein in 1628 aren't that different from a financial crash today.
One event exposing the fragility of an entire system that everyone thought was secure. So here's what I learned from all of this, and why I had to share this story with you. Treasure is not wealth. Silver is not security. Real wealth comes from systems that produce value over time, from investments in productivity, from institutions that endure beyond any one generation. Spain bankrupted itself because it thought owning half the world and endless silver meant power forever. In reality, it meant fragility. It meant dependence. It meant vulnerability. Spain's rivals understood the deeper game. They built systems, not stockpiles, and they inherited the future. History doesn't repeat exactly, but man, its rhythms are hard to ignore. The richest empire in the world collapsed because it confused treasure for wealth. And every society that makes the same mistake, flooding its economy with money while hollowing out its foundations, is walking the exact same path. The question isn't whether history will repeat. The question is whether we'll recognize the warning signs in time. If this story opened your eyes to something new, hit that subscribe button. History has the answers. I'm here to show you where to look.